Omar Jayyam fue un científico, filósofo y poeta que vivió a finales del siglo XI y principios del siglo XII en el oriente del mundo musulmán. En Jayyam se une la investigación científica de alto nivel en matemáticas y astronomía, la reflexión sobre las grandes cuestiones de la religión, la filosofía y la moral, y la defensa de la razón y el pensamiento crítico frente al fanatismo y el dogmatismo religiosos. Jayyam vivió en un momento crítico, cuando la brillante civilización del Islam clásico, que había producido maravillas en los campos de la ciencia, el pensamiento, el arte, la literatura y la espiritualidad, se enfrentaba a la amenaza de la intolerancia religiosa que terminaría por destruirla. Para entender a Jayyam es necesario situarle en su contexto y saber que formó parte de un movimiento científico verdaderamente global, el movimiento de traducción, impulsado por los califas abasíes, cuyo centro fue la Casa de la Sabiduría en la gran ciudad de Bagdad. El siguiente fragmento, tomado de un documental de la BBC, puede servirnos para situar la época.
By the early 8th century, Islamic caliphs ruled a vast territory. And like most successful emperors, from Caesar to Napoleon, they understood that political power and scientific know-how go hand in hand.
There were many reasons for this. Some were practical. Medical knowledge could save lives. Military technology could win wars. Mathematics could help deal with the increasing complexities of the finances of state. And Islam as a religion also played a pivotal role. The Prophet himself had told believers to seek knowledge wherever they could find it, even if they had to go as far as China. And many Muslims, I'm sure, felt that to study and better understand God's creation was in itself a religious duty. But there were also other less edifying motives at play. To many in the ruling elite of the Islamic Empire, knowledge itself had a self-serving purpose, because possessing it was seen as proof of the new empire's superiority over the rest of the world.
But with military and political success, the Islamic caliphs faced an inevitable problem. How do you sensibly govern a hugely diverse population? Although some of the empire had converted to Islam, they were still separated by huge distances and adhered to many different traditions and languages. In the 8th century AD, the empire's leader, the Caliph Abdul Malik, had to find a way of administering this mishmash of languages. Like all the great figures of the Islamic Empire, Abdul Malik lived in a culture without portraiture. All we have are later impressions of what he might have looked like. His solution was sweeping in scale and inadvertently laid the foundations of a scientific renaissance.
It was this Abdul Malik ibn Marwan who said, this bureaucratic chaos has to stop. We cannot continue to run a government and govern all of this span of land with this Tower of Babel languages. So he wanted to govern it with a uniform language. That uniform language, of course, he wanted to be able to understand it, so he demanded that it be in Arabic.
But the choice of Arabic as the common language of the empire went beyond administrative convenience. The decision had extra force and persuasiveness because Islam's holy book, the Quran, is in Arabic, and Muslims therefore consider Arabic to be the language of God. The words of the Quran are so sacred that its text hasn't changed in over 1400 years. By comparison, English has changed dramatically in just 700 years. To our ears, Chaucer is almost unintelligible, whereas any Quran can be understood by anyone who reads Arabic. Making copies of the Quran has always been a specialized and highly respected job since the foundation of Islam. Calligraphy expert Naif Scarf, who lives in the Syrian capital Damascus, writes for mosques and in madrasas all over the country. These are words he's found himself writing over and over again, words of great significance for Muslims. They're the opening line to each chapter in the Quran.
So what it says is Bism illah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim,
which means in the name of God, the most gracious and the most merciful.
بده يشكل مضبوط الفاعل المفعول بكذا ليكون الكتابة صح ولا تفهم المعنى بشكل صحيح.
So it's saying the complexity of Arabic calligraphy was enforced on them because of the spread of Islam, because they were worried the meaning of the words in the Quran would be lost if it was read by people who don't speak Arabic. Then they wouldn't, not only would they misinterpret it, they just wouldn't be able to distinguish between different letters. So not only did they add dots on certain letters, they also added other little squiggly lines which changed the sound of vowels. And it was something that they put in place just to ensure that people were able to have the right pronunciation when they read the Quran.
The consequences for science were immediate. Scholars from different lands who previously had no way of communicating now had a common language. And it was a language that was specially developed to be precise and unambiguous, which made it ideal for scientific and technical terms.
What this meant was the summoning into existence of a vast intellectual community where scholars from very different parts of the world could engage in dialogue, comparison, debate, argument, often very fierce argument, with each other. It was possible for scholars based in Cordoba in southern Spain to engage in literary and scientific debate with scholars from Baghdad or from Samarkand.
But I can tell you that scholars aren't motivated by the love of knowledge alone. There's nothing like a large hunk of cash to focus the mind. By the early 800s, the ruling elite of the Islamic Empire were pouring money into a truly ambitious project, which was global in scale and which was to have a profound impact on science. It was to scour the libraries of the world for scientific and philosophical manuscripts in any language. Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit. Bring them to the empire and translate them into Arabic. This became known as the translation movement. The effort scholars put into finding ancient texts was astonishing. And one key reason for this is that bringing a book to the caliph, which he could add to his library, could be extremely lucrative.
The story goes that the Caliph al-Ma'mun was so obsessed that he would send his messengers out of Baghdad far and wide to distant lands just to get hold of books that he didn't possess for the translation movement. And anyone who brought him back a book that he didn't have, he'd repay him its weight in gold.
To give some sense of the extent of this activity, sort of between 750 and 950, somebody called An-Nadim, who wrote a list of sort of the intelligentsia of the Abbasid era, lists 70 translators. So it was quite a large cohort of people involved in translation, and obviously he only named the well-known. They could get up to 500 gold dinars a month, which is probably around $24,000, which is a huge sum of money for what they were doing. It was a very, very prestigious, well-paid, well-patronized activity.
And motivating this global acquisition of knowledge was a pressing practical concern, one that rarely crosses our minds today. This is the new library at Alexandria in Egypt. But fresh in the memory of many in the empire was the story of the destruction of the original library at Alexandria centuries earlier, and the shocking loss of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge.
One of the things that we tend to forget, because we live in an age of massive information storage and perfect communication, more or less, is the ever-present possibility of total loss. That was very, very important for medieval Islamic scholars. They knew extremely well that writings could be forgotten or buried or burnt or destroyed, that cities could pass away. And what we see in Baghdad or Cairo or Samarkand is exactly the gathering together, translation, analysis, accumulation, storage, and preservation of material that they were well aware could be entirely lost forever.
Volvamos ahora a Jayyam. El resultado de las traducciones no fue sólo la conservación de innumerables tesoros del pensamiento humano, sino también la realización de avances originales en multitud de campos, desde la astronomía y las matemáticas a la medicina, la filosofía y la ingeniería. Omar Jayyam conoció aquel esplendor en Nishapur, que era su ciudad natal, y en otras metrópolis tan importantes como Ispahan o Samarcanda. Hijo de un humilde tejedor de tiendas, Jayyam pudo estudiar con los mejores maestros y llegó a alcanzar cumbres del pensamiento científico. En matemáticas, por ejemplo, discutió el postulado de las paralelas de Euclides y desarrolló el primer procedimiento para solucionar ecuaciones cúbicas y cuadráticas a partir de las secciones cónicas. En astronomía, fue capaz de calcular la longitud del año con una precisión extraordinaria y estableció un calendario más exacto que el gregoriano, que actualmente se usa en todo el mundo y que se calculó varios siglos después. Pero Jayyam tuvo que vivir el momento en que ese esplendor científico se vio brutalmente frenado por dos poderosas fuerzas: la del nacionalismo, que cierra las fronteras al conocimiento, y sobre todo la del fundamentalismo religioso, que persigue la disidencia y la búsqueda de nuevas respuestas. El iraní Mehdi Amidazavi, especialista en Jayyam, explica cómo se produjo ese cambio.
All right, let's move on and say a few words about the time in which Omar Jayyam lived. The time in which he lived was, in a sense, somewhat comparative and similar to, let's say, if you lived during the Taliban in Afghanistan, or if you lived in Iran. Omar Jayyam was well aware of the golden age of the Islamic history. The first several centuries, when Greek philosophy, Hellenic thought, rationalism, peripatetic philosophy was celebrated. Rationalism was a good thing, right? There was no limit. Not a single Muslim philosopher or scientist was persecuted for his belief. Someone like Khwarazmi not only postulated on the fact that the world, Earth, is of an spheric nature, but also calculated the radius of Earth, which came very, very close to the present one. And needless to say, what happened in Europe when someone suggested Earth might just not be flat. And so Omar Jayyam was well aware of it. But at the time when he lived, 11th century, late 11th century, all that had come to an end. Seljuks were Turks, and they were dominating, ruling in Iran. And when when a non-native dynasty wants to, when quote-unquote foreigners want to dominate an alien culture, you have to use two things. One is sheer power, and the second one is legitimacy. You need legitimacy. And the way Seljuks obtained the first one, they had big swords, so they knew how to use that. But the source of legitimacy came from the Orthodox jurists. And so Mu'tazilites, who were the Muslim rationalists, had lost the power struggle to the Ash'arites, the faith-based Orthodox theologians. Much of the early achievements of Muslim intellectuals, rationalists, was fading away. Philosophy had become a bad word. There were a number of philosophers who actually had to write a letter chastising Avicenna. They made up all sorts of stories. I'll just read a few of them. Ahmad ibn al-Hanbal issued a fatwa saying philosophers are heretics. Musa Nobakhti, who himself earlier on was an astronomer, issued a fatwa saying astronomy is a heretical subject. Even Ghazali, in the early part of his Ihya al-Ulum, revival of religious sciences, not issued a fatwa, but wrote extensively rejecting mathematics, geometry, and allowed arithmetic insofar as it is needed to figure out religious taxes. The rest of it is unnecessary. They even made hadith which are not true, one of which allegedly Prophet Muhammad said, in medicine there is no benefit, in geometry there is no truth, natural sciences are heretical, and believers in them shall burn in hell. So science was under attack, rationalism was under attack. The entire Islamic empire was engaged both internally and externally against the Crusades. And I often say that the crusade to the Islamic civilization was like 9/11 to American civilization. When 9/11 happened, all the fuzzy-headed intellectuals were pushed aside, and the generals and neoconservatives and all the people with big guns came to the forefront. And clearly, when a civilization is fighting for its survival, people who say, well, let's sit around and talk and have a discourse and debate and be civil about these things, doesn't work. The person I wrote my dissertation on, Sohrawardi, was one of those. He went to the court of Salahuddin Ayyubi, Ayyubi's son, a Persian philosopher. His argument was that we all believe in one God, we all believe in one truth, so what's this fight all about? Let's talk. Well, they chopped off his head. So, Omar Jayyam knew very well what fate is waiting for him if he were to make the same argument. So that's primarily why he didn't write his poetry. We know about his poetry roughly about 80 years after. What is it that Omar Jayyam is trying to do? First and foremost, he tries to revive the spirit of rationalism in as much as he can. So he writes on geometry, he writes on arithmetic, he writes on algebra, on the mathematical side, right? And then philosophically, philosophy itself had become a bad word. Philosophers were regarded with suspicion. Philosophical discourse was somewhat of a heretical activity. And what does Omar Jayyam do? He writes philosophy. He writes it in a rationalistic manner. He writes in the Aristotelian tradition. He writes it in the tradition of the Grand Masters of the Peripatetic tradition, and in fact was the last philosopher before a period known as the period of eclipse, which Islamic philosophy, philosophical work, at least in the eastern part of the Islamic world, went into eclipse for several centuries. And so he tries to fight that on the religious ground, on the religious level dimension. He tries to do the best he can. And if you cannot criticize the fundamentalists directly out of the fear of death, what do? You do it indirectly. And you use other venues beside writing, perhaps oral tradition. And nothing is more powerful than poetry. And the shortest type of poetry is quatrains, right? That consists of 4 stanzas, 4 parts. Omar Jayyam, in a sense, one of the things I did was, so there are these hundreds of quatrains that addresses all sorts of issues. And was he just writing them willy-nilly? Was he writing them randomly? You read about the lack of certainty with regard to life after death. Then he goes into another subject. So I collected them, let's say, put them in one pile, categorized them. These are the ones he writes in that addresses the question of life after death. These are the ones that has to do with prohibition against drinking and so on. And then I collected lots of fatwas, religious edicts issued by Orthodox jurists, and sure enough, they seemed to match. That was the missing key. Omar Jayyam was, as an intellectual, was in a dialogue with the issues of his time. There were people who were issuing fatwas against geometry, against astronomy, against poetry, relying on the Quranic verse in which it chastises al-shu'ara, the poets, and so on. And so he was responding to them. Every single issue that was of great significance at the time to the intellectuals of the time, he was responding to them. And even though we don't have a great deal of time, but I'm going to read some of these. First and foremost, they accuse him of being a heretic for writing philosophy, and he goes to Mecca to prove that he is a good Muslim. And he writes the following quatrain to defend himself. A philosopher I am, opponents erroneously say. God knows I am not who they say. While I am in this sorrow-laden nest, I know not who and why I am, nor why I should stay. Right? دشمن به غلط گفت که من فلسفیم. ایزد داند که آنکه او گفت نیم. لیکن چو در این قماشیان آمده ام آخر کم از آن که من بدانم که کیم. Right? So this has to do with his defense of being a philosopher. He did not like the jurists. He did not like the Orthodox jurists at all. And so he, in one of his because they were issuing fatwas, issuing edicts, right and left, basically preventing free thinking, preventing creativity. And so he writes, "Oh, preacher." Preacher actually, I couldn't find a better equivalent for it. The real term is sahib fatwa, the one who issues fatwa. "O preacher, harder at work we are than you. Though drunken, we are more sober than you. The blood of grapes we drink, you that of men. Be fair, who is more bloodthirsty, we or you?" Writing this in 11th century, at a time when the court was almost predominantly at the hands of Taliban mentality, is very, very brave. The Persian goes, "A sahib fatwa, zatuhush."
La poesía de Jayyam toca todas las grandes cuestiones que desde siempre han preocupado a los seres humanos: la libertad y el destino, el tiempo y la muerte, el dolor, el placer y el sentido de la vida se presentan en interrogantes que desafían nuestro pensamiento y nos enfrentan al misterio de nuestra existencia. A diferencia de los teólogos, Jayyam no da respuestas últimas, pero nos invita a asombrarnos ante el misterio del mundo y a saber gozar de cada instante de nuestra vida frente a la muerte y el sinsentido. Muchos siglos después de su muerte, en la Inglaterra victoriana y en los jóvenes Estados Unidos, nuestro poeta se convirtió en el autor de éxito, leído y admirado por todas las clases sociales. En el siguiente documental se presentan las razones del éxito de Jayyam en Occidente.
Omar Jayyam in the United States was a sensation and was very much part and parcel in a way to the cultural changes, the explosive array of changes occurring in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
And how was it that Omar Jayyam entered into the popular culture?
Americans seized upon the kind of the impulses of live for the moment, the emphasis upon material pleasure, and an emphasis on fate and a world that is uncertain. And interestingly, a text that starts out as a kind of high cultural product becomes quickly massified.
This is one of my other favorite items. This little copy was purchased in Cairo.
Yeah, I can see Cairo.
By a soldier in the British Army during World War I in 1917. And he has gone through this copy, which he could have fit in his rucksack, and he's underlined all the passages about the inevitability of death. And it reminds you how important the philosophy of the Rubaiyat was to its readers at the time. It's a very important window through which to view World War I.
In some ways, it has become indivisible from a broader American way of life and thinking. But there is a tendency to forget history in the ways in which contemporary geopolitical problems have overshadowed our cultural memory of a Persian astronomer, poet, and mathematician who was the product of an incredibly cosmopolitan medieval Persian world that Americans today, in a kind of polarity of Islam and Christianity as an inevitable clash, have simply forgotten.
During the 19th century, the Rubaiyat became one of the most famous poems in the world. But why did it capture the public imagination?
The very sentiments that Omar Jayyam is dealing with, which are so attractively put into English poetry, they speak to all of us. They're about the human condition and human sensitivity. Life is short, and we feel the poignant irony and the pain of the knowledge that we haven't got long to live. So let's enjoy it. Let's maximize our pleasures. By the way, we'll have another glass of wine while we're talking. A book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. Ah, wilderness were paradise enow.
ما در دنیای زندگی میکنیم که نه آغازی داره نه پایانی داره. آنچه که ما میبینیم تکرار مکرراته، تکرار موقعیتایی است که ای جنون آمیز تکرار میشن و زمان رو ایجاد میکنن، توجه میکنیم، و این ملال زندگی از اینجا سرچشمه میگیره و تمام کوشش خیام اینه که از این تسلسل بگریزه، دم رو دریابه. در تفکر خیام اگر شما از دید از زاویه زمان، تکرار، از زاویه وجود بهش نگاه کنید، یه فکری بسیار منسجمیه در خودش و با تمام شاعرای دیگه فرق میکنه و اگر هم چنین اقبالی در غرب داشت به همین دلیله که فیتزجرالد تونست اینو منتقل کنه.
Dick Davis is a leading authority in the study of medieval Persian poetry. Do you think one of the reasons why the Rubaiyat became important in the middle of 19th century was because it was the right time for that kind of poetry?
Absolutely. There is so much in the poems of Khayyam that spoke to Victorian England. Questioning your faith, that was a new thing in Victorian England. The sense of, Darwin and the geologists were opening up the sense that there's an enormous amount of time before the civilization. That is there in Persian poetry. It's there in Khayyam's quatrains. It was new in England. In England, there was a sense that the past was not very long, and we knew it all. Everything was known. In Khayyam, you have this sense there is this vast unknown stretch of time. Fitzgerald is able to put that into verse and to make it available to everybody. So it's not a thing that only intellectuals know. It's a thing that anybody who can read poetry knows.
Since its publication, there has been an ongoing debate about Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat. How much was a translation and how much was Fitzgerald's own creation?
But we should view him both as a translator and as the creator of an original work. Because after all, it's well known that he reshaped the Rubaiyat. In Persian, all of these Rubaiyat are grouped together and not in any way. They're just alphabetically. They're stacked, aren't they, as if it was in some sort of store. Fitzgerald has taken them out and put them into a really beautifully extended and curved line of narrative.
افسوس که بی فایده فرسوده شدی و از داس سپهر سرنگون سوده شدی در داغ و ندامتا که تا چشم زدی نابوده به کام خویش نابوده شدی.
Edward Fitzgerald died in 1883 at the age of 74. He is buried in a modest grave in southern England. At the side of his grave is a rose planted by the English Omar Jayyam Club in 1893. It was a cutting from the rose tree at Omar Jayyam's tomb. I am sure Fitzgerald would have been very pleased with this connection to his old friend Jayyam. The English connection with Omar Jayyam continues today. I'm at a special ceremony taking place in Neyshabur. This is a statue of Edward Fitzgerald, and they're going to unveil it in a few minutes' time to honor Edward Fitzgerald's translation of Rubaiyat into English 150 years ago.
خیلی زیبا، خیلی قشنگ. احسن به شما که آدم هنرمندی هستید.
کین صبر که امروز تماشاگه توست فردا همه از خاک تو برخواهد رست.
Over 900 years after his death, Omar Jayyam remains a significant figure in modern-day Iran. But what is it about his poetry that still speaks to Iranians today?
در واقع بستگی داره به دوره‌ای که و تیپی که سراغ خیام میرفته. خیام و از آدم‌های اندیشمندی مثل دکتر شایگان رفتن سراغش و مقاله نوشتن تا راننده اتوبوسی که تو جیبش رباعیات هست و میخونه و سرشار از سرخوشی یا سرشار از آنچه که باید رها کرد و از اینکه تلاش تغییر آنچنانی از جهان رو در ذهنش داشته رها کنه و بپذیر واقعیت موجود رو. این کمک هم میکرده.
در این دوره مشکلی نبوده؟ از نظر حکومتگران؟
ممکنه که بسیاری از دیدگاه‌های رسمی با اندیشه های خیام یا مولانا موافقتی نداشته باشن، ولی به علت نفوذ اینها در خاطره جمعی ملت ایران انقدر قوی بوده که خود به خود نمیتونسته همچین اتفاقی بیفته، یا اگرم میافتاده هیچ اثری در محدود بلکه شکوفا شدنش پیش میاد.
Omar Khayyam's influence spread far and wide. His philosophy appealed to Persians from the 11th century and to Europeans and Americans from the time of the 19th century translation of his poetry by Edward Fitzgerald. For me, as a Persian, I take pride in what Omar Khayyam stood for. A questioning of certainties, a refusal to accept that we were put on earth for a reason. He believed we had to make our own reasons and live for this life and not the next one. This was a modern message then and remains so today.